All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Press Fest. If you're just joining us and if you've been here all day, thank you so much for being here. I'm Mara Silvers. I'm one of the reporters at Montana Free Press. I cover health and human services. And I wanted to give a special thanks to our sponsors before we get into this panel. Thank you so much to everybody who helped make Free Press Fest possible. They include the School of Journalism, the Wren, the Montana Community Foundation, the Bacchus Institute, the Mike and Maureen Mansfield Center, and the University of Montana. Thank you so much to all of them. And you are all here for breakout session number 4, which welcomes community leaders, organizers, and policymakers who are working on the front lines of Montana's intensifying housing challenges. We realize that the description of this session in the printed program is incorrect, so we're going to share the correct description. Housing affordability is widely seen as Montana's single most painful cost of living concern, with drastic increases to rents and home purchase prices putting the squeeze on many lower and middle income Montanans in recent years. Many state and local leaders have responded by adopting public subsidies and zoning reform and policies aimed at making it easier to build additional housing in the hope that adding additional supply will slow or reverse rising prices. Questions abound about that approach, and we will be exploring many of them here. I'm very excited to introduce the moderator for this conversation, perhaps the best person to moderate conversations about housing in Montana right now, Eric Dietrich. He's the deputy editor at Montana Free Press. He is an economic journalist and data designer, and the founder of Longstreet's economic reporting project at Montana Free Press. He's worked for the Great Falls Tribune, Bozeman Daily Chronicle, and Solutions Journalism Network. And I think he told me today that he has officially been covering housing and other issues in Montana for a full decade now. So please welcome Eric Dietrich.
Great. Thanks, Mara. Good. So I think get started here at introductions of our panel. They have first going right to left here, we have Senator Forrest Mandeville from Columbus, represents Columbus in the state legislature, also a land use planner in his day job. We'll let him talk about that if he wants. And among other things, this last session sponsored the Montana Land Use Planning Act, which we will be talking about because it is perhaps a big deal for housing affordability. We'll hear him try to make that case. And then next we have Mayor Andrea Davis from Missoula, recently elected Missoula's mayor. Before that was the executive director of Homeword, one of the most prominent housing nonprofit organizations in the state. So has both a nonprofit and a local politics background here to complement our state politics background. And then lastly, but not least, we have Jacob Kuntz, who's the executive director of the Helena Area Habitat for Humanity chapter, one of the more active habitat chapters in the state, notable in part for a project they're working on in and around East Helena that's a subdivision development in addition to just building houses. So again, another important nonprofit, notable statewide there. Before we get started, since it's an afternoon session, I want to ask the audience a question and make you guys maybe look up and think. First off, who's familiar with the yes in my backyard arguments around housing policy? Raise your hands more. So if you're not, essentially the argument there is that the housing issue, housing costs are fundamentally a supply issue, that we just don't have enough houses relative to the number of people who want to live in our state. And the folks that are in that kind of paradigm around the housing, the argument is that the solution is to build more in various ways. Show of hands if you think that argument's a load of bull. Oh, okay, yeah. We will be talking about that as well. Anyway, so the fundamental idea is if you have more houses available, that people, landlords and home sellers just can't negotiate as well and don't have the power to like charge more prices. So it's fundamentally an economic argument. Of course, people critique it because we argue about housing a lot. That's one of the things we do and love. One other thing here, housing is kind of been a perennial issue in Montana. I've been covering it a long time, and I think probably like a lot of folks who read the stories I write, sometimes it feels like I end up writing the same stories over and over again. You know, the rent is too damn high, and neighbors oppose new apartment building, right? We've all read those stories. My goal here is for us to have a conversation that kind of helps us, if we're not already, think about the housing issue in a way that helps us kind of like understand how those stories fit into a greater whole. Like why is it that the rent is too damn high? And why is it that people are trying to build apartments? And that comes in pros and cons there. And that helps us kind of think about this issue in a way that lets us advance the conversation and kind of instead of just repeating the same arguments over and over again. Because I selfishly would like to be able to write some new types of stories. So To start with here, I want to start with Senator Mandeville. Could you talk about the housing bills that the legislature passed last year and kind of how they tried to address the issue, what they did, and I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you, Eric. First, I want to thank you. I want to thank John and everyone else with Montana Free Press for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to come and nerd out about planning stuff and housing issues. I like this way too much. So
it's occupational hazard.
So yeah, the legislature tackled the housing issue head on last session. We passed a suite of bills. Probably the four kind of headliners that you've probably heard about is we passed a bill legalizing accessory dwelling units. So ADUs, things like granny flats, mother-in-law apartments, conversion of garages into housing units. We also passed a bill that would allow duplexes by right in single-family zones. There was another bill that would allow residential development in commercially zoned areas. And then the bill I carried was the Land Use Planning Act, which in the biggest cities and the biggest counties kind of changes the way we do fundamental planning, where land use plans would have to be developed that include a housing needs analysis, and then zoning actually has to match what your housing needs analysis is. So imagine that you actually have to zone to have as many houses as you're going to need over the next several years. And then puts a lot of the emphasis on that long-range planning and zoning. A couple of those bills, the ADU bill and the duplex bill, were held up in court for a while. Just this week, the Supreme Court threw out that injunction. So everything can move forward now.
Great. And then kind of shift to Jacob. I'm curious, are you seeing effects from those bills in the work you're doing with Habitat at the local level in Helena at this point?
Well, we're starting to see conversations about that and how it's going to come into practice. A lot of them have been gobbled up by some of these larger entities and larger towns. So when we're talking about smaller communities like East Helena, which is a small community outside of Helena, that's a much harder sell with some of the requirements. So there's still things that we're looking into. Some of these larger communities have already adopted some of these zoning changes to allow ADUs in residential areas, but they're coming directly in conflict with some other provisions around public safety. Fire suppression is one. Public works is also another challenge when it comes to ADUs. So allowing ADUs is just the tip of the iceberg. You run into a whole host of other issues, including how do you fund that?
Yeah, when you say public works, do you mean, is there enough space in the sewer lines?
That's a big question, of course, capacity. Yeah. But in general, these lines tend to be underutilized in most communities in Montana. So.
Great. And then shifting to Mayor Davis, Missoula is also doing things with housing, right? And a lot of these bills are kind of about the interplay between like what the state lets local governments do in terms of zoning powers. What are you seeing in terms of how those bills interface with what the city of Missoula is working on with housing?
Yeah, Eric, thank you for the question. The city of Missoula had undertaken a robust set of planning efforts prior to the bills that Senator Mandeville covered. And the process we've been underway in the city of Missoula is called Our Missoula, and it's been an examination of our current growth policy, which the large growth policy in effect went into effect in 2015. In 2015, there was quite a different reality here in Montana. And so taking a look at our growth policy, seeing if those fundamental values are still the values that are resonating with residents, and then taking a look at the host of different development codes that we have and making those more aligned to reach community goals that we have. Are you sure you don't work for the city of Helena? Because those issues that you identified were right on. As we purposely here in Missoula wanted to slow down the planning process in a way that incorporates people that don't normally participate in land use planning. People that normally participate in land use planning look like us in a lot of ways, or people like yourselves that are interested in land use issues. You know, people that build affordable homes, for example, or that are land use planners, or that are engineers. You know, people that are both involved, you know, from a professional and often from a personal perspective. The folks that are impacted by these decisions often are not participating in, and I wouldn't say that folks like us are not impacted, but we've really done a large effort to make sure that people across a whole spectrum of different life circumstances are invited to the table to share their perspective on what their needs are relative to their current and future home situation. And that's been really important for us. We have a lot of information on our website that would be very interesting for folks to take a look at. One, for example, is an equity in housing report. And that report is really good. You know, you could take a look at that and say, is the kind of homes that currently are being built or the kind of zoning currently in place in the city of Missoula meeting the needs of the majority of Missoulians? And the answer is no. And so it's like, why is that? And we can take a look at all sorts of reasons. So we've been at work at taking a look at the junk drawer of development codes and realigning those. When the bill, Senate Bill 382, was passed, we did have to adjust to certain standards that the state had put forward. So we are feeling very good, and I do believe that the city of Missoula will be the first municipality in the state to have enacted the requirements of the land use plan that Senate Bill 382 set out. So we were able to do that largely because we were already underway with this work, and also because we have recognized the need to really get out in front of a lot of these issues with our land use plan and our land use codes. And so, yeah, we'll have these things in effect this spring.
Yeah, I want to expand on or ask you to expand on the kind of the participation point there, right? Because one of the things that the Land Use Planning Act does is it tries to I don't know that anybody except me uses these words. The advocates have been, I think, maybe perhaps careful not to, but it kind of tries to short circuit NIMBYism perhaps around some of these discussions by shifting. The goal, of course, is to shift participation land use to the where should we have building housing zoning stage, as opposed to is this project being built near me a good idea discussions, and does that in part by shifting some apartment style projects, depending on the situation, to administrative review out of public hearings, which is less participation. And that's how those laws are, of course, being criticized by the folks that have brought the lawsuit out of Bozeman that Forrest mentioned there. Could you talk about kind of the pros and cons of that and how you're thinking about those participation dynamics, and maybe is too much democracy a good thing in housing, or a bad thing rather?
Yeah, so the way the planning statutes in Montana that have been in place for 50 years have worked is you have basically three completely different codes that you're working with. You have a growth policy, which sets out your long-range vision for your community, for your county. Then you have a zoning code, which you need your growth policy to adopt your zoning code, but your zoning code does not necessarily have to reflect your growth policy. So you can say something in your growth policy, which is not regulatory, say the completely opposite thing in your zoning code. Then you have subdivision regulations. So in your subdivision regulations have a completely different set of criteria that has to be looked at for every subdivision.
So subdivision is you have a farm field and want to build houses on it, and you divide
Right.
that into lots. That's the process you have to go through for that.
Right. So really, you had to go through three processes. You had to go through your zoning process, get your zone change, and then go through the subdivision process again. So you're having to go through multiple processes to do one thing. So what we wanted to do is say, look, if you're in a place where Missoula has said, look, we need X amount of houses. This is a good place for those houses. We're going to zone this place, or maybe the landowner says, you know, I want to zone that for this use. Someone goes in and says, I want to build exactly that. Why have another public hearing on it? You've already had a public hearing. You've already gone through the public process. You don't need repetitive public processes. That just slows everything down.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I would be happy to say that this will be an area that will be, I think, some dynamic community conversations. Having been on the developer side, really, as the executive director of Homeword, we built homes that Montanans can afford. We're a nonprofit organization, but we're a developer, similar to Habitat for Humanity, building homes, whether they were for folks to rent or to buy. And so having been through that process, and seeing some of the challenging regulatory and bureaucratic steps that are necessary on top of all of the other issues that make it difficult to build, and not just even from a regulatory perspective, but getting enough funding and finding land and all the things you need to do. Wearing the mayor's hat, presiding over the city council meeting and having constituents look me in the eye at the podium and saying, how can you do this and where did this decision come from, is a challenge from a local government perspective. We do a lot of work to get the word out for these efforts, and it is something that my colleagues and I talk quite a bit, almost daily, and this is something that I think is got to be germane to this conference and this conversation, is that people get their information from so many different places. I will say, and it's maddening, really, to really try to find all the places in which people feel like they have truly been engaged and brought along on really challenging conversations like these will be. City Council just voted week before last, August 26th, on a subdivision and rezoning and annexation here in our community that was highly contentious. And it was something that wasn't even brought up in the process you're talking about, but it's also around annexation and very close adjacency to the city of Missoula. And it's where the growth policy calls for this kind of development. The immediate neighbors around this area, which are not in the city of Missoula, and this is part of the decision-making that plays into all of this, I think, challenging issue, is folks had basically utilized city sewer and water, but didn't necessarily, we had an agreement to not annex the property for the East Missoula for a long time. And so as a result, there's not been some of the infrastructure improvements that would come along with the municipality. And now there is a relatively large subdivision coming in, and it will provide the supply side that we could argue, when you add supply, adds to the entire housing affordability, because there's more movement within the housing continuum. But it is putting pressure on this one particular part of town and this community, and it will change the fabric of the way this street feels for these neighbors and the reality for people that have lived there for a long time. And that change and those growing pains, that's not something that we can necessarily legislate through legislation and bills. That's really where it comes down to neighbors and folks working together to try to make sure folks understand the change and the direction of the community through the growth plan, and then how these developments will be enabled to be happen through more of an administrative decision. And that will be a fundamental shift and change in Montana. And I'm sure you're going to be writing quite a few stories about it, honestly.
Yeah, one thing I find myself wondering about there is other folks think about how to weigh in here. Right, I know there's a reporter, right? We get analytics. We know how many people read our stories on the web. I know when I read a story about, City ponders new growth plan update with extra R3 zoning, right? Nobody reads that story, right? Like, nobody shares it on Facebook. It's a snoozer, right? I get long emails from land use planners about those stories, but I don't get emails from the general public. But you write about, 5-story apartment building proposed in downtown Bozeman on a site where it's zoned for it, where the growth plan says that's what you want, right? That becomes a long-running community controversy. You end up writing 10 different stories about it, and still have nightmares sometimes from a certain apartment building in Bozeman, right? But so there's a fundamental, and some of it's cultural, just the way we as community members and the public tends to think about, zoning, right? How do you work through that as you're trying to figure out how to address this stuff?
I'm sorry, how do you work through what?
Oh my gosh, how do you work through those tricky conversations around where people it's easiest, I think, to respond to the tangibleness of project proposed next door to me versus should this be R2 or R3 zoning?
Right.
Like,
There's 100 years of housing policy and ways of building housing that worked at a certain time in America, and it no longer works. But we're still contending with the single family subdivision and low density housing that was developed quite a bit after World War II. But the zoning model goes back to early 20th century when we were trying to keep people of color out of neighborhoods. And we couldn't specifically do that. And so we created zoning as a way of doing that. That first got started in Berkeley, California. And that's been a challenge ever since. So part of this is an evolution of housing from something that isn't working for communities, both on the supply side. We talk a lot about the supply side as it relates to people not having housing, but we're having other issues related to communities, related to infrastructure, maintenance. These neighborhoods are not paying for themselves because they're too expensive to maintain because they have such a low density. So in the midst of trying to manage a conversation of folks who have lived in a community where the housing market worked for them, it worked for them for a period of time, worked for generations of people, including my people, my parents and their parents before them, were able to build wealth through a housing market over time. It no longer is working for our current market and where we're at now. And in order to address that, there's going to be these types of conversations. I've been pretty impressed by the coverage conversations that are happening from the bills that are being passed. Some may see this as government overreach in local politics. Another way to look at it is the state providing coverage for small communities and to make decisions to help bring the population along into an evolution of a housing market that not only works for the people who are trying to enter that market, but it doesn't actually work for the people who are living there, because we're hearing this in other ways. We're talking about property taxes. We're talking about increases in, just recently in Missoula, of property taxes to address infrastructure. Those are the same conversations. These are insolvent communities because the housing product that has been developed there doesn't sustain the neighborhood as it's been designed.
I want to put maybe a finer point in that infrastructure, right? But just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about roads and sewer lines and water lines, and also the ability of, like, can you get ambulances out to property? Can you get law enforcement out there? There's Forrest, maybe just ready to talk about this, but there's a lot of discussion about how much does it cost to provide those services, and is that more expensive per resident in lower density rural areas than in urban areas where we don't have to drive the ambulances as far to get to people's houses?
Yeah, thanks for that. And that's one of the reasons why we did these bills that we did, because especially the duplex and ADU bills, what we'd call that is gentle density, where you have the infrastructure, adding a unit or two in a neighborhood, because honestly, people aren't going to go level entire communities to build duplexes. What it's going to allow is a person to, a lot here, a lot there, a garage over there, allow for those to be converted. One unit on a lot shouldn't overwhelm the water and sewer system. If it does, you have a bigger issue. The density issue is a tough one, because the way state law is structured really encourages low density. Especially in rural development, we encourage lots that are more than 20 acres, because you don't have to go through State Department of Environmental Quality Review. We encourage not putting more than 5 lots on a tract of property, because that's a minor subdivision and you have a quicker review process. You don't have a public hearing with a minor subdivision. We encourage putting the lots right along a county road, because that way you don't have to build any additional infrastructure. We encourage individual well and septic, because that way I don't have to extend a public service system. I don't have to build my own public system. So the incentives that we created do not push a developer towards density. And the way that the legislature was looking at it is, we didn't want to necessarily push someone towards density, or high density or low density. We wanted to make it possible for someone to develop higher density developments, make it pencil for them, to where they Maybe they don't have to go through a conditional use permitting process to move their mother-in-law into a finished garage, to move a kid that just finished college into an upstairs apartment.
So conditional use permit basically means you need to go to your municipality and or county and get special permission. It's not something that just, you can do that by default.
Right.
And which means paperwork, hearing, right, slow, maybe they won't give it to you, right?
Paperwork, hearing, some of that NIMBYism, that not in my backyard stuff that can come up.
You shouldn't let my neighbor do that, right? Yeah.
And it's as a land use planner, it is somewhat personal to me. I reviewed a fourplex about 3 blocks from my house last year, which had to go through a conditional use permitting process. And I mean, honestly, there were some good points. Is the fire department going to be able to get there? Yes, we checked with them, and it is good for people to ask those questions, be able to ask those questions, and have their concerns addressed. But a lot of it is, who's going to make sure they take out the garbage? Same person that makes sure everyone takes out the garbage.
So there's a point in there that I think is kind of implicit if you work in the land use planning industry, but actually took me as a reporter a long time to figure out. And that's that one of the fundamental things about housing construction is that it's not something that local governments do. It's something that local governments review, right? We built almost all the housing in this country is built by the private sector. Sometimes that means nonprofits, but usually it means people that are trying to make money, even if there are public incentives in there to kind of encourage them to do particular things. And so one of the fundamental dynamics about housing is any new housing that's built in this country has to pencil out, right? Somebody has to be able to make money or at least not lose money doing it. Since Jacob is probably the closest thing to a private developer we have on this panel, I wanted to ask him, I've heard a lot from you in the past about housing costs and like why it is hard to bring houses to market at the prices you would like to be making them available at. Can you talk about that a little bit?
The number one thing is land. That's not going to be any surprise to anybody. Developable property that is in access to infrastructure, and I'm not trying to be jargonistic, sewer lines, water lines, streets, sidewalks, infrastructure that allows homes to be constructed. In Montana, the market is still hot for the single family house. People are still coming here. This isn't xenophobia. This is just the reality of our current economics. It's a nice place to live. The markets are changing in a way that I consider it to be close to when steamboats put the wagon trains out of business and rail lines put steamboats out of business, and now we're seeing the interstate system that put the rail lines out of business for many towns in Montana, and now we have people who are able to work remotely and work in their jobs, but they're able to live where they want to, and so the single-family housing market is hot. They can sell that all day long, and the land developer can sell the land underneath those homes for $10 to $15 a square foot. And that's how they look at it. They look at the price they can get per square foot and the amount it takes to build the infrastructure to build those homes and how quickly they can get that done so that they can get their money in and then they can get their investment out. There is no motivation for the private developer to increase density because they may increase the per square foot by a couple of dollars, but it triples the amount of time it takes them to get their money out. So when they're able to sell that single family house all day long for that $10 to $15 a square foot for the land underneath, they're going to take that choice over what the needs of the community are. And so you have the tax base that is undercut because of that. So you're seeing neighborhoods, single family neighborhoods that are 3 homes per acre, 14,000 a square foot. That's similar to what Walmart's paying for their space as well. But higher density neighbors can double, sometimes triple that amount just by getting density. It decreases the property value, property taxes per unit, but increases the per acre taxes. So that's a big challenge. Yes, they have to make money. You have to understand why they're building that way and why they're going to continue to building that way in Montana unless we find ways for municipalities to not just sit back and be application checkers where they're checking the boxes of a subdivision application, but we put them in the position to be negotiators where they bring something to the table and say, okay, we want you to build in our community. We're going to offer you an extension of the sewer line. We're going to offer you something to help you get your neighborhood in, but we want double the density that you're proposing as a result. Right now, there's very much this these two siloed positions where you've got the local jurisdiction who's reviewing the subdivision application, and you've got the developer who's looking at their funding stack, and there's not a negotiation going on. And so we're getting a lot of more single-family homes built in Montana, and I'm not seeing an end to that at the moment.
It seems like part of the dynamic too, right, is a cultural thing, right? Which kind of feeds into like that you can sell single family homes like with yards like hotcakes, right? I hear a lot from people when I talk about density. Well, nobody moves to Montana to like live in an apartment. Everybody like moves here to have a little bit of elbow room, right? Particularly folks that are coming to more rural areas than perhaps Missoula. How does that square with the policy arguments coming from us smart, sophisticated people about pushing for density?
Yeah, we're used to seeing something. If you're used to seeing something a certain way, it's hard to change. I mean, look what's happened down in Ravalli County with a roundabout. You're used to seeing a stoplight, right? You're used to stopping at a stoplight, and boy, and then somebody brings some European concept of a roundabout, and that seems insane until you put it in place and you use it a couple times, and all of a sudden you get used to it, and you're like, well, this isn't so bad at all. That's the same way with neighborhoods. If we're used to seeing single-family houses with a white picket fence, the moment there's something else there, all of a sudden it looks like from someplace else, and there's a resistance to it, and it looks out of place until we get used to it. It's not that the market doesn't want to build missing middle housing, and by missing middle, I'm talking about duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. I'm talking about multifamily housing. It's that the land isn't being developed to accommodate that because we're used to something, but that thing that we're used to is broken, and it's not serving the community. Now, it wasn't serving the community there, which is barely scraping by. And now that prices have increased and the cost of maintaining that infrastructure has increased, we're in a situation now where we're going to be forced to move that direction because it's going to be, or we're just going to put up with the way things are, and we're going to shove everybody into an apartment building.
The thing that I would like to add to that conversation is that on the additional dynamics of developers' risk, when you may want to build if single family or even let's say townhouse style homes, and you yet need to still rezone that property. So that is an additional risk that the developer is managing. And, basically they're financing that risk. They're buying not only the land, but maybe potentially the infrastructure improvements, and then to go through zoning and potentially for that zoning to be declined, even if that zoning meets the growth policy, but because of the political persuasion of constituents, basically going to city council and saying, no, we don't want that here. And that's a real reality, right? So that's the not in my backyard concept that you're talking about. And when you talked about conditional uses earlier, that's how conditional uses came about, right? People came about and said, well, we don't like that. So you had a person, an elected official, add that to the list of conditional uses that required developers to come and basically go in front of a body of people to address. The city of Missoula eliminated 50 conditional uses on an emergency basis last year in order to basically deal with some of the most emerging issues we were recognizing around basically streamlining development opportunities to get more homes on the market. That has now been made permanent. So part of the process that we've gone through in terms of the code reform work, we did some interim code reform pieces that while the ADU bill that was currently being adjudicated and now has been resolved, we were in process of also addressing how do we make accessory dwelling units or granny flats easier to build in Missoula. And so we had actually adopted some of these regulations both in October, in accordance, of course, with some of the state laws that were passed, but then just this spring, we addressed some of those conditions. The opportunity that municipalities and the incentive that we can bring when we don't necessarily have a pile of cash to incentivize through maybe infrastructure development is that we can say, we are looking right now at our land use map and our land use code. And that may mean that we are looking at what has been traditionally single-family zoned home neighborhoods and saying that duplexes and triplexes or quads can be built in these neighborhoods. An interesting statistic in Missoula right here, and this is in our equity and land use report, is that in 1932, when we had our first zoning code, we allowed multifamily in 85% of the city. Now, granted, the city was smaller then, for sure, right? We've expanded.
And multifamily means apartment building, right?
It means apartment building, but yes, for at that time, I'm assuming 4 homes or more. I don't know. I actually might look to you to say in 1932 was that actually the consideration, but yes. And now in 2022, 36%. So going to what we're talking about here, if we can address simply through allowing, how I like to think about it is like the fabric. Well, what can the municipality do? We can create the fabric by which people can respond to some different housing types. I will say that thank you to the legislature for funding infrastructure investment for the first time in decades and decades and decades, along with what we're talking about around the mentality that really took place in the United States, not just in Montana and here, but in the United States around anti-growth. One of the concepts, and it was here, it still is here in Montana, is that growth has to pay for itself, which by the way, it doesn't with taxes, so we just heard about that. But also, in terms of developers pay for all of the infrastructure and utility expansion. Those costs get passed down to the end user, the homeowner or the renter. And so when we can facilitate affordable infrastructure, the state just passed through some of its surplus, some infrastructure dollars on what's called the State Revolving Loan Fund. The city of Missoula accessed that and deployed it immediately on a project that we're building. And it's very low interest infrastructure dollars, and that makes a big difference on the overall cost of the product. The city of Missoula has had some really unique opportunities because also in the 23 legislature, they enabled redevelopment agencies through the use of our tax increment financing mechanism to actually use tax increment financing to build bricks and mortar. So our state law up until now has allowed us in urban renewal districts that have an area that needs basically some investment in terms of infrastructure. We could only put public infrastructure in. So we're talking about sidewalks, we're talking about street lights, we're talking about water and sewer. Now we can actually put some money into the bricks and mortar. And the city of Missoula is currently underway with an 89 unit townhome and condo community land trust on our north side of town. Half of those are deed restricted affordable for people that are earning about 100% of the area median income in Missoula. And that is a tool we have that we can actually do our own investment and make sure that we have homes that are affordable to our workforce into perpetuity.
Yeah. Before we move on, I want to make sure we give Forrest a chance to talk about the culture change and perhaps preference for elbow room, since you're kind of our rural guy on the panel here.
Yeah, so the question that comes up is, I'm used to this. I'm used to seeing that. That's what has, we talk to realtors or bankers, that's what is sold in the past. That's what I'm comfortable with. But when you talk to people on the ground, the question is, where are your kids going to live? Are your kids going to be able to afford to move back to Montana? Like the mayor said, there's wide swaths of our communities in Montana that made it really, really hard or illegal to build certain types of housing. And when that's the case, you can't, if a developer wants to build a duplex, but it is going to take longer, it's going to be less predictable, and it's going to be more expensive to build a duplex than a single family house, guess what they're going to build? A single family house that they're going to sell for $500,000 instead of 2 duplexes that they can sell for $250,000 a piece. So, and even if you don't have kids that want to move back, what if there's an issue where you need some money in your old age and can do an accessory apartment on your home? What if you want to convert your home into a duplex or convert your lot into a duplex? These are things we wanted to make sure are options, not mandated, but options for property owners.
Great, thank you. Kind of shifting a little bit, I want to come back to the kind of our title question here. Can Montana build its way out of the housing crisis? Yes, no, why? Let's start with Jacob.
Certainly, but not the way that we're building. So, I mean, that's just one of those questions. If you built enough houses, then obviously there would be, there'd be plentiful housing and that everybody would have a house, of course. But trying to use the old methodology to be able to achieve that is, unsustainable. The missing middle housing now is something that we're going to have to spend more time paying attention to. The type of housing that converts somebody who is aging in place in their home, as Forrest was mentioning, turning their home into a duplex. The low-hanging fruit of what's happening within communities is building on the existing infrastructure. But just saying that doesn't address all the other challenges that pop up as a result of adding population to that infrastructure. We're going to have a very uncomfortable conversation about what is too safe when it comes to public safety. A couple of years ago, we built an ADU. We were experimenting in Helena, and this is why I know more about ADUs, is that the zoning allowed an ADU. We tore down a garage. We built a 2-story ADU. We tried to split the property and create a land trust so that we could sell each one individually, and we ran smack into the fire marshal's office. Even though it was on a corner lot, they didn't like the fact that it was behind the house and that they wanted it on the front of the street, and so they said they couldn't run their hoses. And even though you could say, well, obviously you can run your hose, you park the truck right here, you run the hose over there, that's how you put out any fires that happen. It's just, that's not allowed. These are going to be things that we're going to come in conflict with. The other issue is parking. Always is traffic and always is parking are the issues that come up. We are car-driven societies. Removing parking mandates within the city limits of towns is one thing. We have to be doing something on the other side, which is investing in public transportation that might, mean that somebody doesn't need to have 2 cars. Maybe they only need 1 car now. Those types of issues, I think, are. Now I've forgotten the question.
It's on the screen in front of you there. You already said yes. You already said yes.
We absolutely can. But we've got to start building neighborhoods and showing land developers and builders why they want to build these neighborhoods that are built to bridge this divide between the way things were, the single-family housing development, and this new structure, which is going to have smaller lots. You're going to have more attached units. You're going to have more of that row house feel. You're going to have cottage court units, smaller units. A lot of the covenants that require 1,400 square feet in a single-family development, that's for a very specific purpose. It only allows you to build a certain house that only qualifies a certain person with a certain income bracket. So we get those types of people. We need communities to be all types of people. Cities used to be built around that. We used to have all kinds of different housing, including boarding housing, and we had duplexes, and we had people living in multi-generational housing. And for good reason, it was a lot of shabby, crummy housing that was built substandard. And a lot of that stuff has disappeared. And a lot of this older homes that are in Missoula and Helena and places like it are the higher end, very quality housing. So there's got to be this bridge between public safety and building safe, decent, affordable housing, while also kind of taking a look back out of the page of the past and saying, we built communities that had a variety of different housing units to meet all income brackets and all ages and all abilities. And we've gone away from that as we put all of our focus and all of our efforts into the single family house, detached house.
Same question.
Okay. My answer is eventually, and I'm hopeful. And the reason it's not a yes or no is because I think we need to be mindful of a few things. The market takes a while in order to address these things. So the legislature passed bills in 23, and there's, I will say that, and I've heard people ask me this question. The legislature passed this bill, and so your vacancy rate has went down. That is awesome. Those two things are actually not correlated, and I will say that's because I, myself personally, when I was the executive director of Homeword, We permitted a 202 apartment complex in 2018, and that was just leased up in 2023. Now, of course, we went through the pandemic and a number of things, but it takes a while for these projects. When you're talking about big projects and financing and all the development and getting it leased up, the market takes a while to respond. Now, the reason that we are dealing with it from a regulatory perspective and a code reform or regulatory perspective is we're hoping to shorten that time frame. But we also are dealing with the market, and we are dealing in the United States in a capitalistic market when it comes to housing. And so the reality is that we need to be able to monitor and make sure that folks that are living in our communities still have the ability to rent and buy the type of places that we see getting built. And when I say and there's opportunity for us to take a look at, like, do we need interventions in the meantime? I was just taking a look at some data recently in my old world when I was doing affordable housing development. And 15 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe more like 15 years ago, we could provide, through an organization I was on the board of directors we could provide a $1,500 down payment assistance loan or grant to help a first-time home buyer get into a home in Montana. Now, and where our markets are right now, it's $100,000 in order for somebody earning basically those same wages, young professional wages, in order to get into a home. And supply is a major aspect of this. But I just want to put a warning out there that I don't think it's the only thing, because we have an entire country that is on the move, that we have people that are retiring with wealth and moving to this area. We have folks that are working remotely that earn different wages than place-based wages here. We are competing with those. And if we only say that it is supply that's going to answer this question, I think we will fall short. But I think it is absolutely an integral part of the equation here.
Right. So I want to get to you, Forrest, but to build on that, right? So we need things other than supply too, kind of like in a single sentence, like what would those things be?
Well, I would say that we need incentives that we have the opportunity through, in a single sentence. We need housing
Please.
policy that basically helps folks be able to get into, I would say, home ownership and rentals more affordably. So we need basically to buy down the cost of housing.
So putting tax dollars into helping people afford.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I was on the Housing Coalition for as long as I was, is working to get a statewide housing policy place so we could actually do some of those things on a statewide level.
Great. Thank you. Forrest.
So even if we can't just build to get out of the housing crisis, you can't get out of the housing crisis without building. So building is 100% has to be a component to addressing the crisis we're in. You know, sometimes I might get in trouble here, but I don't always like the terms affordable housing or even workforce housing, because I think they sell the issue short. I prefer more of a, we need to make sure that our communities are providing housing for a variety of people at a variety of income levels, at a variety of demands. Not everyone wants to live in a 3,500 square foot house on 20 acres. A lot of people do. Some people, that is an absolute nightmare to have to mow that. And over my dead body, am I letting my wife get a horse? So that was a joke, guys. So there needs, yeah, you can't afford the house and a horse. So there's got to be a variety of stuff that people can build and that is available for people to buy. And that's how we're going to be biting off chunks of this crisis. And you know, Jacob put it well, and so did Mayor Davis. There's a variety of pressures that we're dealing with in the state, and honestly, I do put the blame on a couple of things. I blame COVID and the increasing ability of people to remote work, and I blame Kevin Costner and his dumb shows that make people think that this is just some type of ranch fantasy. You get out here, and we had 40 below at my house last winter, and hopefully that chased off a lot of these people.
So we can build our way out of the housing crisis only with 40 below winters. So how many audience questions do we have out there? I'm trying to decide if we should pivot to that now or if I should keep yapping. Sounds like we probably got enough. Are we doing okay on time? I didn't actually bring a watch up here, so I don't know how we're doing. Great. Half an hour more? I'm going to do one more question for me and want to do it to audience questions. Oh gosh, I got to make up my mind. I think I think we probably should put a question to the panel explicitly about do we need to put more tax dollar funded stuff into housing, right? Do we need to be using, let's make it at the state level. The state level, do we need to be using state taxes to address this housing issue, right? Which is, I think, politically a harder sell, particularly on people on the right, than a just deregulate and make it easier to build. I think that's just the ideology and the way that ideology is reflected through our politics. That's a steeper hill than some of the regulatory reform stuff that passed last session. I think I can say that as an objective fact. Anyway, but is that a political fight that's necessary for us to get to where we need to be? Maybe start with Forrest.
Thank you. As I mentioned, what the tack the legislature took to address housing was largely a market-based approach and a make it possible to build approach, make it more feasible to build certain types of buildings. We did, as the mayor mentioned, we did put some money into helping communities build into infrastructure improvements. We also put some money into grants for communities to address some of these plans that might build made some of these communities right. So we wanted to make sure that there was that infrastructure on that administrative infrastructure, even on the towns. It is a hard lift, and I'm not sure how it would be structured to get support, but it is a hard lift to just throw money at the problem.
It's also expensive.
It's very expensive, and it's not very it's not always real efficient when the government is throwing money at problems. Honestly, private developers are pretty efficient because they're driven by their bottom line. They're trying to be efficient. When the government's doing it, a lot of times there's not that efficiency mandate. We try to be efficient because we're good public servants, understand that we're dealing with the public's money, with your money, with your tax dollars. But when you're spending someone else's money, there's a lot less drive to be efficient with it than when it's your own money.
So my perspective on this, and largely my background, and I say yes, there is an opportunity here for there to be state and local housing policy. We have a certain set of housing policies here at the local level. And last session, when we had a significant amount of state surplus resulting from a number of different things, we were advocating as the Montana Housing Coalition for a number of different policies that would have provided more incentives for building certain types of homes that were permanently affordable to different income tiers. And we did. We got more invested in housing policy in the 2023 legislature than ever before. So that's fantastic. Could we have done more? Yes, we could have. And some of the things that I do think would be very helpful is making sure that we are funding different kinds of mechanisms like revolving loans with low interest. We did not, in 2023, we did not have the interest rates we do now, and but they were climbing up there. Over the course of several years, we worked on getting a program. It's a multifamily loan program that the money for it came from the coal trust. And so there's basically a low interest loan that can go out to these multifamily properties. And that makes it possible for these projects to be feasible. And then they can keep the rents low. That kind of mechanism gets the state back its money, and it's also secured through private development. So I think that's a win-win. Those are the kinds of things I think we need to do. And that's an incentive for that developer to cap basically its rents when it can, or keep them more affordable. Because we had such a large surplus, we could have done some really interesting things. I think we could have actually created a trust in a way that would have enabled us to have something into perpetuity to be able to address some of these issues. Because like I said, can Montana build its way out of the housing crisis? Eventually, and I hope so. And again, because we are up against market factors here, and we have to be able to react to things that we may need to intervene in order for the people that are earning their wages here at this university, for example, to be able to live and work in the community that, people like the police officers and firefighters that work for the city of Missoula. We just passed an ordinance 2 weeks ago extending the distance that police officers and firefighters can live to the proximity by which they are addressing emergencies because they cannot afford to live close to Missoula. These are things that we need to be real about. Yes, we're going to address it through regulation. We're going to address it through incentives through our zoning code. But the reality is that the city pays those wages. Those are taxpayers that pay us your taxes to pay those folks' wages. These things are all connected. So if we're now going to jump people's wages up to actually hit a $550,000, $600,000 median home in order to pay people to be able to live close enough, we have to ask ourselves, can we do that? Or do we need to be able to have some way to incentivize housing stock for folks that are living in these communities and earning their wages here? It's a complicated question. There's no yes and no, and I think that's probably the frustrating thing for all of us.
So the one of the largest receivers of federal subsidy is the homeowner, myself included, in the form of the mortgage interest tax deduction. We subsidize home ownership every year to the tune of $30+ billion. We've incentivized that because we saw that as part of the American dream, which was a marketing campaign that was put together by bankers to sell the fixed rate mortgage. The Habitat for Humanity is known as a home builder, and that's the simplest way to think about what we do. And I think for a lot of the years, that's the way I looked at the way we do. Realizing that what it was set up to do was to create access to capital to people who were left outside the system, specifically Black sharecroppers in rural southern Georgia, who were not allowed to get a mortgage up until the 70s in America. Black family could not get a home mortgage. It wasn't until the 1970s that women could get a mortgage without being co-signed by a male relative while filling out an application on pink paper. We are in not the home building business, we're in the creating access to capital business. And we do that through a home because our system is centered around the home as a source of wealth building in America. And that's how it worked very well for generations of people, as I've mentioned, myself included. My wife and I bought our 4-bedroom, 2.5-bath house in Helena in 2015 for $184,000. It was a single owner house back to 1950. It's an ugly house, and it needed a lot of work. Room by room, we've gone through it just as we could. It's a 10-year project we've been working on. The house is worth $450,000, and that has nothing to do with me, my work ethic, who I am, or how dedicated I am, or my place in the community. That was simply the matter of good timing. We bought low, and now it's risen. But there's a group of people that are being left out of that system. And so the only way for us to move forward with that is we've got to get better with money. We have to leverage every dollar that we have, and we've got to compound that and think about it just like any business would. Nonprofits are a business, and we have to be, dare I say, a bit greedy about it. We've got to be selfish in the pursuit of every dollar matters, and every dollar that's put into the community to building these homes is precious and necessary, and it's got to be moved forward. Anytime I can turn it over again and again and again, we've got to do that. And over time, we've realized in order to truly control what we're building and the cost of building, we're going to have to get into the land development business. So now we're in the land development business. If the government came and invested in that, I'm not saying in an entity, but in that type of pursuit, if there was a community out there that was trying to achieve greater density and create opportunities for more people, that should absolutely be invested in by communities, and we should consider that as a noble pursuit. Unfortunately, we sometimes treat this as a bunch of people with their hands out and with their hands in their pocket. we've got to create a way forward, and the only way to get that way forward is changing the way that we're thinking and being a little greedy about how that money is spent. And part of that is this permanent affordability piece, which we've been doing more with land trusts, where when we build a house, we say, okay, your equity is going to be capped because we're going to change our thinking about this. This isn't an investment opportunity. This is your shelter. But we also think that you should earn some equity by owning the home. You're going to earn 1.5% of the sales price a year, so that some years from now, if you ever sell it, live in it forever, but if you ever sell it, we want to know it's going to be available. So then you're building a community investment that stays with the community, hypothetically for the life of the home, which we know these are 200-year plus homes that we're building. These are investments in the community that actually do have a specific return, both in tax base, but also in stabilizing the workforce, which is such a problem. For years, when we were looking at communities, growth policies always talked about economic development in the form of jobs, and the second was always homes. Well, that's flipped now. We've got the jobs, but we don't have the places where they can live. And that requires some investment. We're willing to invest in economic development. We're willing to invest in business development. Are we really willing to put our money where it matters and invest in the homes where those jobs go to sleep at night? I stole that from Sheila Rice. So. Yeah.
Probably a good time to shift to audience questions. We have mics out in the audience. Trying to prioritize people. Sorry, Zeke. Trying to prioritize people who are not Free Press staff members. You can call these people and ask questions. Like, that's one of the things you get to do as a reporter. It's super fun.
I thought you were saying they could call it. I mean, you can call us, but.
Yeah.
Appreciate y'all being up there. I wanted to talk a little bit kind of on the point Jacob's just mentioned, and I guess I wanted to ask about the feasibility from both the state and municipal level looking at land trusts. Is it realistic that we can build a segment of the housing stock that is decapitalized, that is removed from these market influences? And of course, we're going to have to invest in it. I'm not saying can we build it for free, but I'm saying can we potentially build housing stock that is set aside to meet the needs of the community rather than meeting the economic needs of the people building it? Is it feasible?
I would say that it is feasible, and we are in a position right now where, and to get into a little housing policy, although I bet many of you do know what we're talking about, a community land trust is when the land itself is held in trust, and it's often held in trust by a nonprofit. So it might be Habitat for Humanity, it might be Trust Montana, or in Missoula here, it's North Missoula Community Development Corporation. And the home is built, and that's what the homeowner purchases. And because there is often public investment in that land, right? It's usually grant funding or philanthropy that buys that land. And the reason it's affordable is because when you or I go buy that home, the land is taken out of the equation. And so that in and of itself makes it affordable. And you want somebody still to be able to get into that affordable home, so you do what's called an equity cap. You make it so it doesn't just go skyrocketing through the roof, but some way to make that home continually affordable. There was a time here in Missoula and in Montana when somebody could move from a community land trust home and they could move into the market, because eventually, you know, the way we talk about community land trusts is a wonderful alternative to renting. You are building equity, but you're not building equity at the rate that you are in a conventional home that is, again, going up by the whims of the market, or might be going down by the whims in the market. But that's not really the case here in Montana that we've seen much. So
Not since 2008.
right, and even here in Missoula, not by much, right? And so we really are in a position right now where we need to be focused on the fact that we have some housing stock here in Missoula that is in a community land trust, and that means that I like to think about that as housing affordability infrastructure. It's here. We have secured that through deed restriction, through ways that we have created these programs, but folks cannot get out of those homes now into the market. And that's where hopefully through what we're doing through the market approaches, through land use and regulation, that helps address it. But then also maybe we need to think about, do we need the next step? And can we use a community land trust for that next step? I would say yes. Thank you to the 2023 legislature for expanding the definition of workforce housing. I know you don't like it, but it's in legislation that allows us as a municipality to use tax dollars tax increment financing to actually invest in workforce housing. So the city of Missoula right now, I mentioned we have this project under construction on Missoula's north side. And I said, oh, about 100% of the area median income, which for Missoula, oh, I'm throwing a dart, it's about $60,000 right now, I think, for a single person, maybe a little more than that. And that's not wages, I'm gonna tell you, that's income. We can debate that later. But so there's actually a range of different purchase prices at that project that we're building. And it ranges from 80% all the way up to 120% of the area median income. We can do that because that's local money. If I was using federal grants, which has often been what we've utilized, you could only go up to a very much lower area median income. And so we need much more flexible dollars to address what traditionally has been conventional market wages. That's what we need to be able to address to eventually get to what you're talking about.
So basically means that those houses will be sold, you can sell those houses at a higher price than you could if you were using just federal dollars.
That's
in a way
right.
that creates a second rung on the home ownership ladder instead of just the first one.
Exactly.
Because the market is 5 steps up now.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
I think Mayor Davis really hit made a good point there, because we can't, you might say we can't just build our way out of the housing crisis. We can't community land trust our way out of the housing crisis either. And what we don't want to do is create those 2 tiers of home ownerships where there's the rich people can afford to buy their house that has uncapped equity, and everyone else gets the capped equity house. So there's a lot of things that have to work together to make the housing stock in the state work.
Go ahead, and next question is, all right, Aaron, maybe, oh, where? Aaron is a former Free Press reporter. God help us.
Hi, my name is Aaron Kimball-Sandin. I was a Free Press reporter. I am technically here in my capacity as a freelancer for the Pulp. So I do have a reporter question, I'm sorry. I guess one of the things that I think is obviously a pressing issue in Missoula is how, given the slow rate of sort of market feedback to these reforms, how do we begin to resolve the housing crisis for people who are in literal crisis, right now? And obviously there's federal subsidies and programs and stuff for these people, but obviously people are falling through the cracks just based on the nature of the fact that there are homeless. So I guess I'm sort of wondering how that fits into this broader conversation.
All right, as a Missoula representative, I'll take that.
Yeah, this is kind of for you.
All right. Yes, and I wouldn't. I just want to. I don't want to say the market has failed this. It's just that we haven't gotten there yet, right? Like the city is underway with our code reform project and our new land use map, and that means new zoning codes. I mean, that's what this is going to result in. That's going live this spring. And I want to say to Missoulians in this room, be engaged. The information and your engagement, we are asking for it now. We've been asking for it all along, but I'm telling you, like right now, make sure that you're participating in these process, ourmissoula.org, because there is so much out there for you to lend your voice to and make sure that's reflected in what will be now our host of regulations that help folks build more middle income housing. The things that we can continue to do right now for people that are in crisis. Some of the things that I borrowed from my nonprofit days in the housing world, we're going to continue to extend those type of incentives, where I was just meeting with a group involved in economic development, and somebody that is a local individual that is interested in a large philanthropic gift. Talking about creating a housing fund here in Missoula that one of our housing partners here in Missoula could manage. And it would basically be a revolving loan fund that would help target properties and different things like we've talked about today. And so again, it's not going to turn the switch tomorrow in order for us to address folks that are in crisis now that might be losing their home as I speak and sleeping in their car tomorrow. If you're in Missoula, you've seen that the city has been trying to manage a current situation with folks that are living unsheltered and how we manage that all the way up the continuum of how we're getting people into home ownership opportunities through things like land banking. The city has a housing policy, and my recommendation to municipalities across the state would be put some plans in place. Because once you bring the community together and you put a whole host of different strategies in place, that's where we start to then see some action. As soon as the city of Missoula put our housing policy in place in 2019, we immediately then set about to create an affordable housing trust fund. Now, that doesn't have a whole lot of money in it right now. However, we do funnel all the federal grants that we get to the city of Missoula through that and prioritize different kinds of housing projects. When we land bank and we purchase a piece of property strategically and sell that property, we make sure a portion of that often goes into that affordable housing trust fund that we can then use flexibly on the projects that we talked about. We need to be talking constantly with the private sector and with the public sector around how we are going to address some immediate solutions. We are not really in a place where there's like a whole lot of old hotels. If there were, I would be talking with folks about how do we buy those up and make sure that we can get people off the streets and into those hotels. But that's an option that we should be thinking about. And so I wish I could give you an answer right now about like what we can do to flip the switch. But my answer to that is that this is a multifaceted issue and we need multitude of different solutions to answer it. And that's really what we are setting about here locally. We're partnering with the state on this level and partnering with the private sector. It takes all of us. It takes all of us every day to do this.
So I'll tag onto that. A little bit of a confession. I stole an old newspaper from an abandoned house. Well, first I have to back up. I trespassed into the abandoned house to steal the newspaper. It was an old newspaper sitting on the floor of this old house I was looking at, and it was from 1959, the day after the Quake Lake earthquake. And that was, of course, the most interesting thing, but when I stole it and took it home, I was looking through the back, and on the back page was an ad from Gamble's Furniture Store in Helena that advertised a living room set with the couch and the chair and a coffee table and a magazine rack and a couple of lamps. I promise this is getting to a point. It was for $299, 1959. You could get that living room set, which is the equivalent of $2,600 today. Pretty affordable. In the classified section was an ad for a build lot in the city limits of Helena, quarter acre, 12,500 square foot building lot for $275. So 1959, you could buy a building lot that was a quarter acre for less than a living room set. And I'd like to ask, well, show me your $150,000 living room set, because that's what it costs to build to buy a lot in the city limits of Helena today. I'm telling that story so I don't resort to cliches about, the best time to build a tree, but, these are things that have been slowly creeping up for decades that haven't been addressed. We knew that the outskirts of Helena was the Wild West, and as far as building, with everybody putting in septic tanks and sinking wells, and having roads going, thousands of miles of roads out there that none of them are paved. They're all dirt roads, with rural fire departments bearing the brunt of the public safety out there, which today has the average firefighter whose average age is 72 years old in the Helena Valley. We know what we need to do. The question is if we're going to do it. And the question is, have the market forces gotten to the point where it's going to require a change that's going to supersede all the arguments not to change? And there's a myriad of arguments not to change. Partly it's because, well, we don't want my home value to decrease, or I'm worried about traffic, and what about the public safety fees? There's a lot of reasons to say no. The question is that the market change to the point where we can actually start putting the pieces in place to make a change so that 20 years down the line, we're not asking the same question.
One thing I want to add is this is not a problem with a quick solution. There isn't one magic bullet that we can use that's going to build 500,000 affordable units in Montana tomorrow. that's not possible. One of the criticisms we've gotten in the legislature and in past sessions, well, we always get criticized, but one of the criticisms we had on housing policy, on zoning and land use policy, was everything took too long. Because we'd nibble around the edges, we change this. And, you know, as a planner, you're taking a 20-year view of something, right? You change it now and you hope that there's changes 20 years down the road that are tangible. But what we were told was, we want immediate changes. We want something that's going to change right now. And that was some of the thing that we took to heart when drafting some of these bills, is we wanted them to take effect sooner rather than later. And we wanted them to be somewhat far-reaching. And we wanted to give developers and municipalities these tools to start bringing housing online as soon as possible.
Another audience question? Anybody have a question? We'll get these folks to disagree.
Yeah, it's segue on what you just brought up for us, kind of where I wanted to. So in Helena, down close to downtown, if you walk any of the neighborhoods, there are many duplexes and fourplexes, right, with the single family homes, pretty small lots. That became, I think at one point, and there's alleys. And back in the 90s, we had an organization called Plan Helena, and one of the campaigns we ran, let's make alleys legal again. Let's make downtown neighborhoods legal again. Because at that time, you couldn't build a traditional downtown neighborhood. The zoning wouldn't, we were going to that single family thing. And in the most recent Helena growth policy, which they're already needing to update, I guess it's 5 years now, and then they're having to come into compliance with this new law, and they're sort of doing a future land use map. They came up with this idea of, you know, people want walkable neighborhoods. This is in the city. I live in the valley just outside of the city, and Jacob mentioned some of the problems there. So I remember going to a meeting, and there's these 4 nodes. The idea was, well, let's allow some, you know, a dentist's office, lawyer's office, little commercial zone, and more dense, walkable, you know, housing above retail, starter family without kids, could be close to work. But you talk to a developer, they can't build it. They can't make any money building that. But the city, the people say they want it. So then I was in a meeting where I said, well, when are we, you know, there's an implementation thing in the growth policy. When are we going to start on these nodes? Well, we might start looking at number 1 2 years from now. And it's like, this is just before the housing crisis started. My question is, there's things we say we want to build, and this is kind of what Jacob's getting at. Right now, the market forces means they're not affordable, but they probably are better solutions 30 years from now for our communities. So how do we bridge the gap there? And particularly in towns and in the Valley and Helena, which we're finally zoning and, you know, trying to extend some infrastructure to. Can we do it when that's done to allow more of this creativity? How are we going to, you know, Jacob's talking to this, how do we bridge that gap somehow?
So that's part of what Senate Bill 382, the Land Use Planning Act, was trying to get at. This, you do your growth policy, and then you do your zoning and your design standards and regulate around what your growth policy and future land use map said, instead of having your growth policy over here, your zoning code over here, your design standards over there. They should work together, right? So you're not saying, yeah, we like this type of development, but we're not going to legalize it. What we were seeing in a lot of communities was, in a lot of developments, we're going straight to the planned unit development concept, which is basically mixed zoning. So what I was seeing was, if you dealt with zoning, you were coming in with a PUD almost by default. Because that would allow you to kind of choose your own zoning and write your own zoning code, and you wouldn't have to, just specific to your development, and you wouldn't have to worry about this weird zoning that didn't match with anything. You darn near had to do a PUD so you could show compliance with the growth policy, even though growth policies are not regulatory, and that's not a criteria.
And of course, a PUD is a lot more work than actually just following the rules.
Right. Yeah, so let's make it so the rules can follow what you want to see and make those work together.
Trying to get the density where it needs to go within the city limits is harder than ever because, folks like me who have a 2.625 interest rate at 15 years on my house are really going to be hard pressed to unlock that sweetheart deal in order to do what's necessary on my lot to get the proper density. There's actually room for 4 housing units on my lot without making it too squeezy, right? So I have a 1/4 acre lot right downtown Helena, and there's no reason I couldn't put a little, apartment in my basement, that I couldn't put a little cottage in my backyard in one corner, and then I couldn't tear down my garage and build an ADU. I could create 4 housing units where there's just one, but I'm locked into that sweetheart interest rate deal, and so right now it's going to be really hard to get that infill. These big builders, these big developers, they're also not going to do that type of product. So part of it is, can we incentivize these smaller builders, these entrepreneurs, these homeowners who are, some folks who are aging in place, looking for different ways of getting revenue to be able to stay in their home. We always talk about, hey, there's no place for these people to go. Well, that's assuming they want to go anywhere. Maybe they want to create that duplex out of their housing unit where they don't do any changes to the outside. They just put in a studio apartment inside their existing housing unit. But where do they come up with the funding? One thing that could possibly happen is that municipalities could think about micro TIF districts. I'm not sure if state law allows for this, but it is an option where there's a funding source to help people do those modifications, to add units, to add that type of housing to the stock of housing, into the infrastructure within city limits that's paid back through the tax base. I'm really outside of my.
Let's maybe move to another question before I'm tempted to try to explain TIFs.
Come on, Eric.
Not today.
Mayor Davis touched on this briefly at the beginning in terms of the fact that people get their information from a multitude of different sources. What do those of you involved in the public process and those of us in the media who have covered the public process do to address the fact that people are saying, we had no clue that this was happening, and how do you better reach those people in the future?
Honestly, my idea is that every time a municipality changes a code, they should say it's a backyard chicken ordinance or a leash law or something like that. You get 1,000 people to show up at the public hearing, and then you say, actually, we're not doing that. What we're going to do is discuss curb and gutter requirements.
So we need to have a bait and switch provision in the public notice laws.
That's a creative option. That's a good idea. One of the things we've done just for the particular project I've been talking about is investing in an engagement specialist. It's not been easy because we don't have a lot of room in our budget, despite tax increases and all the things. It's not like we can say, well, I came in as your new mayor 9 months ago, and I'm going to add a bunch of staff to do this. That was definitely not an option. But we knew that with this code reform project, and we knew that at the heart of it, we really wanted people involved in the city of Missoula that have not traditionally been involved, that we hired not a communications specialist, not somebody to just do digital communications, but an engagement specialist. And this is somebody that's working with other communications folks in the city, but that are really making sure that we are showing up as an organization and doing engagement activities at different kinds of events. That might look like, one of the things that they started was a chats in the park over the summer. And it was different city departments often that get a lot of questions. And oftentimes people don't how does it work when we start to put in public infrastructure and shut down a city street, and how do we prioritize our capital projects and things like that. And then this zoning code, we made ourselves available where people were, and that was really very helpful. It requires us as a community and as a municipality and as taxpayers to invest in that kind of engagement. But I do think that is where we need to go as government in a lot of ways, because putting out press releases, and people do, the reality is local press still picks up all of our stories. I'm interviewed all the time. I see not only that on, local TV and their social media, but if people aren't watching that, then it's like, what do we need to do? And I think every city I know is going through this challenge of how do we adjust how we have been communicating, and digital communications is one of those things where we really need to take a look at how, in addition to all the other things, we are utilizing different types of social media in order to get our message out and bringing people back to things like we're working on a city newsletter, for example. We joke around about, is that state-sponsored media? And maybe the answer is yes, it is.
One thing comment here, not a question, but one thing I see as a reporter, as I'm trying to figure out how to get people to read stories about this stuff, particularly about this proactive land use planning, is that one of the challenges that you kind of have to have a vocabulary in your head of like how planning works and like what different words mean and like what zoning means, what subdivision means, what R2, R1 mean, before stories about land use stuff become interesting to you. Before that planning before you can go to an open house and like feel like you actually have like insight to provide. And it's a challenge, it's a civics education challenge to get people to the point, I think, where they'll read those stories instead of just the bad project proposed in here near me, like stories. And I don't know how to get there. I think I, as a journalist, try to think about how to write stories that help people, that draw people towards that understanding. I would love to see government entities perhaps do a better job of like figuring out how to this is what this means. Oftentimes the public notices, they're written by attorneys according to state law, right? And I can't interpret those half the time. There's a challenge there too.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, how do we basically make these concepts more understandable to folks that are not policy wonks or, living in municipal government? Yep.
One more question. How are we doing for time? We have time for more? One more. Make it count.
Well, thank you. This has been super interesting, and I don't speak the planning language very well, but it's been fascinating. I'm curious, I live in Helena. We seem to be willing to invest and give tax breaks to maybe big box stores on the outskirts of Helena, but we're hesitant to invest in more dense development downtown, like on the strong towns model. And I'm wondering if you might just talk about that a little bit.
Anybody from Helena want to talk about that? Or okay, well, so I can speak from Missoula's perspective, and I think we're seeing the opposite here. Although we often will get criticized by the general public that they see our use of urban renewal districts and tax increment financing as corporate giveaway. And the reason being is because when you create a district that says, okay, this spot right here, there is blight in this part of our community that needs tax investment. We're going to draw a boundary around it, and we're going to basically use the tax increment that is built from this to do public infrastructure. But the tax increment has to come from somewhere. And so how the system works is you say, well, I'm going to bond for this project. So that project might be Kohl's department store. This happened on Brook Street. It was an old, basically gray field. It was Kmart and Big Lots that had been out of business for more than 10 years. And those buildings sat vacant, cracked cement, grass growing up through the asphalt. No development was coming back in. Along Brook Street, which is Highway 10, it's a fast corridor. It's problematic, actually, from a redevelopment perspective, until you really you put some thought around what would make this actually what kind of investment can we create here? And so we bond for the public infrastructure involved in remaking that area. And that bond is paid off through the taxes that are earned on that, plus some. So when I say plus some, that means that now there's taxes that have basically grown up in this area that pay back that bond, and the additional taxes we can use on other infrastructure in the area. So more sidewalks, we put in a stoplight on Door Lane. We did those things because the tax base increased in that area. It's confusing, it's wonky, and people say, that's corporate giveaway. It's not corporate giveaway. We actually made a loan. We bonded, we made a loan to that project, and the taxes are paying it off, and we're using that to then do infrastructure in other areas that now there's been other development that has come around that. So that is an area where you could say, well, that seems like it's a big box area, but we have these zones in different parts of our community where we're able to invest in the smart towns, urban downtown Missoula, when you walk downtown, and if you walk along the river corridor next to the Holiday Inn, for example, and or the AC Hotel, those areas were all also urban renewal districts, and we use tax increment financing to incentivize those developments. And it's a very bustling part of our community today as a result of those investments.
Yeah, great Helena representation, by the way. Thank you. Appreciate that. Way to go. Yeah, so, and I'd mentioned that about Walmart, the 14,000 an acre. That's Helena Walmart numbers. There's very little infrastructure on that 19-acre site. So they paid $272,000 last year in property taxes in Helena. But, it's all parking lot, right? So, and it's not maintained by the city, it's maintained by Walmart. So it's all private land there. So that 14,000 an acre, that becomes net to the community, and it helps to offset these single-family housing developments where they're getting the same amount or similar amounts per acre for their tax base, but they got all those roads and all those sidewalks and everything they have to maintain, and they've got to, got to move. What, are you trying to shut me up, Eric?
No, 14,000 an acre, is that how much Walmart's paying for the taxes, or is that how much the property's worth and the taxes are a subsidy?
That's how much
of that?
they paid,
Okay.
So that's not a tax valuation. It's obviously worth much more, but like direct dollars that they paid last year. So, so there's a little bit of that. There's a bit of a misunderstanding, and I think this is part of like, as we get into like taxes are really important, property taxes more important than ever. The community that we're designing in East Helena. By the way, Charles Marone is coming to East Helena on November 22nd. So he's going to speak there on his book, Escaping the Housing Trap. I'm not his publicist, but he is coming. The neighborhood we're designing, although it's low income, right? It's going to be mixed income with market rate units all the way down to Section 8 units. We're projecting 25 to 30,000 per acre. Because we've doubled density in there. We're talking about 7 homes per acre, less per house, but more net over the course of that entire development. And so some of that is just, we got to maybe rethink about how we imagine commercial in the midst of that. So.
Great. Mike, am I getting a we need to wrap up sign from the audience there? Okay, I have time for one final question, or we're just calling it? I have one I want to ask, but I can skip it. Very quick question, right? So this is a challenging issue. It oftentimes feels like one where we get stuck, where there's not a lot of optimism. The rent's just going to keep getting up. Montana's getting expensive. It's going to become a playground for the rich. I think we've done a pretty good job of maybe complicating that narrative. Now, there's a journalism buzzword. But last question, in terms of for people here who are community members or citizens or just Montana residents who are interested in participating in this issue in ways that help solve the problem, what advice would you have for them? Like, what can people do individually to try to solve this stuff?
I would say get involved. Join community groups. There's a lot of communities have openings on planning boards or other boards that are looking at this type of thing. So see where you could be of use and learn the issue and volunteer. And you can always call your legislator and have suggestions or
Politely, maybe?
politely call your legislator or your mayor.
Be nice. No. Well, I would start by reading the Montana Free Press. The coverage is excellent. And I would also say that there are a number of other local news sources and other news sources. Read your local news. That is covering so much housing-oriented information. In addition to what Senator Mandeville said, in your community, encourage either community groups to gather to have this conversation. Encourage there to be, dare I say the word, task force, or a way in which a working group can come together to say, do we actually have a plan? What are we solving for? Who is at the table to start to have this dialogue? And as neighbor to neighbor, are we ready for the change? What would that look like? How do we make that easier on one another? Those are the kinds of things I think every citizen, every one of us can do. And there is an enormous amount of information out there on housing policy, some really interesting and great things. You have organizations in your community in Helena, the Habitat for Humanity and others, the Housing Authority in Helena, same here in Missoula. We've got, Habitat, the Missoula Housing Authority, Homeword, the city. There are these places where there is information to just familiarize yourself with these concepts. There's a ton of really good podcasts and things like that that actually make it really enjoyable too, to a certain degree, where learning about these things and layering on this information helps us all be more informed on how it is that we want to, put good policy and decisions forward.
The public service anymore isn't as attractive as I think maybe it once was. It seemed like in the past, like there was a lot of respect that was given to public servants. And I feel anybody who steps up to the plate to serve their community in that way is making a really big sacrifice, because it is a thankless, loveless, especially in a time when there's so many challenges and so many things that have to be addressed. We need to celebrate when there are successes, when our representatives do things that push against the status quo, that allow us to think a little outside the box, that push us toward evolving as a community. A community that's not evolving is dying. So when something happens, when we're trying to try new things, we're trying to revive and restore and create something, that should be celebrated. And I would encourage you to be encouraging of those folks, because it is a sacrifice. They hear from people who are upset all the time, and they don't hear folks who are proud of them. And so I'm proud of you. I think you're amazing. And I think Missoula is so lucky to have you. And Forrest, the same thing. You're doing great stuff for Columbus and your district. So thank you for your service.
And thank three of you all for making time to show up and answer some questions and put yourselves out there, right? I think, I don't know if you caught the session before, right? But we appreciate, those of us in the press appreciate when elected officials will return our phone calls and engage with tough questions on this stuff. So, yeah. Yeah.